Marcelyn Gow is partner and founding member of Servo Los Angeles and works in close collaboration with their affiliate, Servo Stockholm. Marcelyn has contributed to journals such as Perspecta, VIA, and AD. She is also the co-editor of Material Beyond Materials and On Ramp 4. Marcelyn has received a grant to individuals from the Graham Foundation, a Pasadena Art Alliance Award, and a City of Los Angeles Department of Cultural Affairs Visual Artist Fellowship. Servo's work has been exhibited widely, notably at the Venice Architecture Biennale, the Centre Pompidou, Archilab, Artist Space, and the SciArt Gallery, the Max Center for Art and Architecture, the Storefront for Art and Architecture, and the SF MoMA, and is in the permanent collections of the SF MoMA and the Frac Center. Marcelyn has been a visiting professor at the Royal Institute of Technology, KTH, in Stockholm, UCLA's AUD, and the ETH in Zurich. She currently teaches graduate design studios and critical studies seminars at SciArt and is the Design of Theory Fellowship Coordinator. Marcelyn is the newly appointed Undergraduate Thesis Coordinator and Media Content Manager at SciArt. I would like to read a short description before we begin. There was said to be a city of no architecture, no objects, just things. It was a never-ending horizon that obstructed itself from itself. There was a perverseness to how normal it acted, suggesting that nothing has been disturbed. Things bundled up to make larger things. With their in-betweenness so defined, it became their own thing. Being submerged in this implied place was haunting. Unsure if it was too big or too small. Do you record it, sample it, draw it, or use it? Instead, let us mark a perimeter around this place, and call in the only architect that is in no need of a path and comes in with her own tools. Marcelyn Gow, thank you for taking us through the conversation we are about to have.
Thank you, Zaid.
What do you consider was your first architectural project, and could you maybe describe it?
My first really pivotal work was a project called Lattice Archipelagics. That was an early project that I did in 2002 with my collaborators in Servo in our original form prior to Servo Los Angeles. We were called Servo, and there were 4 collaborators. And this was a piece that we did for the Architecture Non-Standard Show at the Pompidou Center and for an exhibition that Zaha Hadid invited us to called Latent Utopias in Graz. And for me, it was really a formative piece, not the first work we had done as an office, but the first really seminal piece, where it allowed us to think about how we would reflect on changes in kind of the technology that was coming to the forefront at the time, the use of digital technology, how that was changing the kinds of things we designed, the way we designed them. Also, specifically at that time, we were looking at how interaction design could be integrated with architecture. And so one of the themes that we've worked with for a long time and that I continue in my trajectory of work at Servo Los Angeles has to do with things that are more ephemeral or fleeting in their duration, and things that are much more kind of inert or static and tangible. And so in that project, really there was a kind of obsession with how the human presence in the space with the kind of objects that we were placing in the space could create different effects, different changes in the atmosphere of the space. So it was a piece that responded to the movement of bodies, of visitors to the exhibition space by triggering illumination in the piece. So the lighting was constantly changing depending upon where people were standing in this space, and how that would change the presence of the physical objects themselves. So we had these things that were called lattice cells that were PETG vacuum-formed kind of modules. And the geometry of those really began to become almost clouded or confounded by the presence of the light. And so to me, that was a huge discovery that also tied into some of my academic research and in terms of my the research for my dissertation, I began to look at these instances where artists and architects were working with technology in such a way as to integrate ephemeral qualities with much more kind of static qualities.
Your earlier work was very modular, with the systems working together. As your work progresses, it becomes less about the module, more about the thing. Could you maybe talk about the move away from modularity, and what did modularity do that you no longer want in your work, or what is it that you're trying to achieve that modularity couldn't?
It's a very interesting question because, yes, a lot of our early works, like the lattice archipelagics or a project called Sporg that we installed at the Mack Center for Art and Architecture here in Los Angeles, those projects were highly modular in the sense of the challenge really for us was to say how could we take a kind of templating geometry or a sort of basic geometric primitive and aggregate it in such a way that you could produce different formal qualities across, I mean, those projects were really dealing with kind of field conditions and how you could produce variations of a piece by installing it in different ways, in different spaces, but always using the same basic set of pieces. So that was kind of a primary interest for us at the time. Currently, our work really has shifted much more toward, in some instances, there is a modularity, like a show we did here at the Art Gallery in 2013 was called Aquiotrope, and there it's a highly modular piece, although the way that the modules were treated produced a series of objects in the space that actually no longer appeared to be the same. They appeared to be kind of unique objects. And so there is a kind of loosening of the legibility of modularity. Also in another recent work that we just did this summer at the Los Angeles Municipal Art Gallery called Semblances, there, I mean, it's interesting to spin on modularity as being something that is kind of a literal geometric module that gets repeated identically, or something that has different attributes, like in the case of the Semblances exhibition, there were photographs of stones that we defamiliarized graphically, so in a two-dimensional defamiliarization of the image, and then we use those to produce three-dimensional voxel models. And depending upon how we manipulated the image, the voxel model that resulted had different articulation, different surface qualities, slightly different resolution. So in that sense, I would say, again, there's a kind of a variation on the idea of modularity, where there is some kind of, there's a template driving the production of all the pieces, but it's not necessarily as tight a fit as a modularity would be.
As a digital practitioner and researcher, you seem to have avoided the obsession with precise geometric control, and instead embraced corrupted geometry that you believe lies outside computational control. How do you view the dependent relationship of both medium versus their independent outcome?
I was trained, actually, I had a series of fantastic teachers in my career, notably Greg Lynn, Jesse Reiser, Nanako Umamoto were very influential on my development as an architect. Also having then taught with Greg Lynn at the ETH after I had been a student of his. And really there I learned very much about extremely precise sort of control of geometry and a certain virtuosity of modeling. I mean, those were issues that were really kind of part of my education. And I valued them very much. I think today, this is looking back to a moment where architects were really beginning to integrate some of these tools into their design process. and actually really creating a certain degree of ownership over them, tailoring the approach to the technique, and really beginning to work with the anticipated outcome, that you would model something extremely precisely and then you would rapid prototype it extremely precisely. And the two things fit very well together. I think today we're in a moment, I think it's very important that students learn that skill, that degree of control, and how one can then edit that. I think having that as a basis, then we fast forward to today, where I think we're in a moment where there is kind of a new obsession with how we almost process the surroundings, and taking things that are sort of as found and filtering them and producing new things from them to create a kind of resonance with the existing environment that's being sampled. So that's why I think the use of things like video capture, photography, that taking those forms of media and using them to generate digital models, three-dimensional models, is a very different way of working, because one's not starting with a kind of geometric control, but rather starting with the image of something, or a kind of animation of something, and then translating that into another format. And to me, really right now, one of my huge interests is in architectural acts of translation, and what those could be and what those entail, and how those change our relationship to anticipated outcomes. Really it changes our role as a designer as well. I think not in terms of embracing chance into the process, but actually looking at how once one engages in these translations again and again, we start to begin to anticipate the logic of that, and we can begin to go in and edit and work with that in a really productive way. So I think that's been a shift.
That's really interesting that you talk about translation, because that's where the next question is going. If I was to find a word to describe you with, I would say that you're in translation, oscillating between two translations constantly. This always allows you a unique platform in creating gaps in perception. However, when are the gaps too big and the ideas become too abstract, or is there such a thing?
That's actually a question that I just really confronted during the exhibition at the Los Angeles Municipal Art Gallery for Semblances, because we had a gallery talk. The exhibition was very generously sponsored by the Los Angeles Department of Cultural Affairs and their individual artist fellowship program. So most of the people in that exhibition were artists, visual artists, so-called. In the gallery talks, there was a non-architectural audience primarily who was coming to the work in a different way. I think there I learned about what these gaps in perception might be, where as an architect, I think the fascination with seeing an image on the wall and then seeing a 3D printed model that is directly almost extruded from the image, and placing the two together and then beginning to look at like projected shadows on the object and shadows that are in the image, and kind of starting to call into question what is derived, which one came first. That was, to me, it was really about this sort of, how do we begin to understand these two different things in relationship to one another. The gap maybe becomes large when people are looking for a specific meaning in the image itself, but not taking it as almost a filtering of found objects in an environment, but actually kind of scrutinizing it for meaning. So there, I think in the gallery discussion, one had the feeling that some people were desiring to kind of understand, why is that image chosen, why is that image important? Whereas for me, it was more about a kind of equal footing for, it could have been an image of many things in the world that would produce many different objects. And it was more about the translation than the specificity of the image itself. Although really I would own that Certain qualities were of interest. The fact that the image could appear at one moment to be a stone, at another moment it could appear to be something that one would find in a constellation, or something that would be almost a deep hole into a space. So there were multiple readings that became sort of desirable there. And then from the 3D prints that were produced, the multiple readings that really one could start to think of them as potential proto-architectural building masses, which I think was incredibly exciting to imagine how some of those features would scale up onto an architectural scale and how their legibility would change at a different scale.
That brings a question to mind about scale. Do you think your work has scale? Do you operate within a scale? And is the result an actual scale?
Definitely, yeah. I think there's always, at Servo, we've always been really focused on the production of pieces that are actually physically manifest in a space. So a lot of people call that installation. So we have done many installations. But rather than focusing, we've never really been a practice that's focused on renderings or kind of photorealistic representations. But things are exactly what they are. So if there is a drawing in the Aquiotrope show here at SciArc, there was a drawing of the geometry that was driving all of the pieces in the show. That drawing was inscribed in its full scale on the wall as a vinyl, really impressed into the wall. And the idea was that the drawing doesn't represent another scale, but it is that exact scale in that exact space. And at the same time, one could see the relationship to a glass-blown lamp that was made from a mold derived from the same geometry, but the lamp is a smaller piece. But each thing had its own specific scale. Usually we try to work with the oscillation where two scales are kind of competing with one another in a space. So like in the Semblances exhibition, the fact that some of these rocky 3D prints could at once look like a rock that could be picked up in your hands, but at the same time could also suggest how a building is sitting on a ground plane and how it might be entered. And so fundamental things about massing and grounding were really part of that exhibition. So I think that the suggestion that different scales flicker, but everything does have a very specific presence relative to the other pieces.
Drawing to models, to buildings, could be seen as a regular trajectory for an architectural project. However, in the case of Servo, it seems that drawings can become buildings, drawings can become a way of modeling, and drawings can also become text. However, modeling, drawing, and text don't equal each other. Can you talk about the relationship of these three things in terms of your approach?
The modeling and the drawing, yes, it's interesting because sometimes, usually, oddly enough, the drawings come after. The modeling occurs in 3 dimensions, and then the drawings are sort of extracted layers from those models. So the Aquiotrope drawing was literally a registration once we had taken the specific geometric primitives and performed the Boolean operations of subtraction or addition. The resultant wireframe that we had in the 3D software had certain areas where the line becomes thicker or thinner, and we actually embraced that as something that gets included in the drawing. That line weight was not driven by the convention of a section where you would cut through an object and outline the thickest line as the edge of the object, but the thick lines were actually tracking where something had cut away. So the drawing was a very challenging drawing to read because it sort of called into question many of the conventional ways we use line weight. Other drawings, like from a project Block Terrain that we did in Stockholm, a proposal for a residential project near a central square. That project it's Katrineholm is the small municipality where that was located. But that project, we started to model forms that had a kind of rusticated quality, and then to do a series of contours through those and use that to produce a new drawing of textures that were actually not there, but that were generated through sectioning the three-dimensional model. So there's this kind of relationship where drawings are extracts of using a model to produce different kinds of layers of, one could say, of information in a sense. Then the text is something, I love words. I always have enjoyed writing, and reading is very important to me. And I really think that it's fundamental to architecture that there are different ways of expressing one's ideas, that sometimes those ideas will come out through a model, a physical model, sometimes through a drawing or some form of representation. And then at other times, one can actually write down, whether it's a scholarly or academic writing, or whether it's more of a prose or a fiction, or even something that is more related to a poem, something that uses the word to kind of reposition us relative to the space that we're conjuring. And so I would say, just as your introduction, which I think is really beautifully written, a really fascinating, fantastic piece of text, in much the same way that one can meditate on certain qualities and then translate them into a set of words. And one could imagine, a drawing giving us another view of that same set of effects or that same space, but in a different way.
Tracing your work's process can be a difficult task. We are never sure if the final product creates a process that then becomes the product again, or a product where the process is replaced with a fictional story. Can you explain the role of process in your work?
The process is, yes, often it's not really called out through a set of diagrams, but it will, I guess, produce different pieces of the project. Because I'm realizing, even as we speak now, it's interesting that I am thinking, well, yeah, most of the projects that we do have a number of constituents. Like, it's rare that there's just one thing. I mean, we have designed some proposals for buildings, also like the vector interference multi-purpose hall in Stockholm, where there was a whole series of models that we used to develop, again, working with Boolean cuts in a roof plate. It was related to the aqueotrope show that we did here at SciArc, but in very different ways. But the idea of the similar geometric operations, producing in one instance a series of tiles, of roof tiles that are placed on a floor. In the other, it's actually a roofscape over a lecture hall. And I guess in those projects, the process would be, it almost has to do, I think, with some of the references that we look at when we're working. So for the roofscape project, we were looking at Mansart's town hall in Arles, and the amazing stereotomic vaulting, where the grain of the stone is kind of changing relative to the major cuts in the mass that form the interior, and sort of inverting that logic onto the roof. But that process never really gets seen per se as a series of diagrams. It could be presented that way, but I think it gets kind of almost layered in or laminated into the final product.
So just as a clarification, your work isn't meant to be mysterious or too complex to be understood. Do you mind people understanding exactly how the product was made or not?
Oh, no, I don't mind that at all. I think that's fine to actually, if they know, like in some cases I even joke about some things are very dumb in a sense, very simple, like the case where an image is used, extruded to make an object. It's kind of almost couldn't be simpler, but at the same time, the choice of the image, the way the image is treated, and the way in which the extrusion is performed will all there's so much to work with there in terms of variables and fine-tuning that depending how that process is done, sometimes it's more evident to the viewer and sometimes less evident. In our early work, like the project Lattice Archipelagics that I began talking about, I think there it was something with the interactivity that we found to be really one of the problems was that you could write a script, you could install proximity sensors in a space, you could script particular effects for sound or light to be emitted depending upon the presence of people. But what was disappointing there, we were more interested in the kind of ambient effects of those things and how people would experience that, and that they would have a loose relationship to the fact that they knew that in some way their presence was influencing that thing. But what often happened is people wanted to figure it out and like, I got it. If I go here, this will happen. And so in a way, I think that's why we moved away from that, because it became very much a kind of technical problem that once you understood, it was almost like the intellectual challenge for the viewer was in decoding that. And that to me is not interesting. I'm much more interested in the implied associations that a thing can produce and the way in which we can have multiple readings that kind of coexist within a thing. And so in that sense, I think to open something up for multiple readings, there has to be a degree of, it has to be loosened a bit from the fact that we know exactly how to apprehend it. So maybe it relates to this contemporary discussion that a lot of people are having about estrangement. A lot of people are looking again at Viktor Shklovsky and Theory of Prose, his book where he outlines the notion of estrangement, where it's just small things about something can be changed in order to really make us to kind of unsettle our kind of, what would you call that, apprehension of it, that we don't know exactly what it is. We think we know, but then we realize something is not quite right. And then that opens up a possibility for us to see that thing in a much more profound way.
Talking about readings, let's take that discussion a little bit further. You constantly challenge and shift the role of the architect. In my opinion, you've reversed the role of the architect from order to disorder. It's no longer our job to produce information that's legible to others to use. It strictly belongs to the author. Do you agree with that statement?
Well, I think it depends on what part of the project one is speaking about. I mean, in the project where there is a certain process that's set in motion to yield an architectural entity, that, I guess there's almost like a reversal, because I think at a certain moment, we need to fundamentally understand and be very adept with the conventions of our discipline and of our practice. And so being able to produce documents that could be handed over to someone else to actually read and understand and be able to reproduce the thing that we want to be reproduced, I think that's extremely important. Like, I think we have to be able to engage in that. Otherwise, I'm not sure it's still within the realm of architecture. I think then maybe things slip into, okay, this is a work of art because it shuts itself down at a certain point and it doesn't have any other job than to just be what it is. I really believe that everything we make can be communicated. There are different information sets, whether that is an STL file or whether that is a plan or section document, or whether that is a physical model, that the pieces always are intended to be able to be transferred in a sense. Like, there should be the ability to kind of hand that off or to take that to the next, maybe, you know, the level of translation would be back into a set of documents for how could this thing be constructed. Having said that, it's something it's a good question because I deal with that a lot in my design studios here at SciArc. A lot of the vertical studios, we have looked at how particular effects on one scale could be reproduced on a different scale. And so the question, if you're working with something like wax, for instance, and there are very specific characteristics in a small model, that how would we then, would we restage? Would we literally scan that and then send that to a fabricator and break that down into panels and have it like CNC milled so it looks like the stuff the wax did? Or, and this is the huge question, or do we invent another procedure that operates on a larger scale that has a similar logic to it? So the outcome may not look exactly like that initial model. And that's an interesting territory, because I think that's also, we're still very much within the realm of architecture, but we're accepting that the scale of something, that certain effects are not directly scalable, and that one has to almost invent another process for reproducing those effects. I mean, it might, some of these might be, one could accompany with images that would clarify. It's, yeah.
Yes. Talking about the fabrication, let's talk about a little bit about material. You've never had a representational project without material allocation. There's always texture, a state of influx, and primitive qualities. Can we imagine you as an architect disguised as a material engineer?
I love working with materials and actually allowing the material to exert a certain degree of resistance on the kind of anticipated formal outcome. So again, I find that really productive in terms of how, again, having learned very fundamental skills, as we all do as architects, with how to control model making techniques and working with materials that are much more familiar and sort of inert, and then shifting that. I mean, I have a large interest in casting and other forms of kind of sort of looser forms of casting, which enable parts of a form to be kept very, what would you say, to be very precise, and then other parts where you allow the material to compromise that precision. And I'm not sure if that's answering the question exactly.
But no, I think that reflects that the idea that also that material and behaviors, and whether the material is being challenged or whether material is allowed to act as it wants to.
Yeah, the material, I mean, so I'll take the case of the glass lighting fixtures for the Equitrope exhibition, where we CNC milled very precisely a foam positive mold, and then we made a negative plaster mold from that. And then we had the glass blown into the plaster mold. So the mold is extremely precise. It has kind of the sharp edges of the geometry kind of built into it. The glass is something that its ability to pick up those marks and to take that form will depend upon how hot it is, how much pressure it's blown with. And so those variables were something we wanted to push to a certain threshold to see, okay, how can we get a series of things that are all made from the same mold but are slightly different? And we were really interested in those differences. So again, there is a certain pushback where it's not that the material is subject to the form, or that the form always wins out. It's kind of a challenge for the two, I guess.
That takes me right to the next question, moving away from material and into form. Your work never tries to define a space. It has space or cavities embedded in it without defining it. As in, it could be air, or views, or circulation, but without the sense of a drawn perimeter. In context of space, how does your work sit?
Well, I think space is something that's actually, I mean, that word has been a little bit on the margins of architectural discourse in recent years. There's been such a fixation on, in particular, the exterior, the envelope. I mean, the object, the contemporary take on the object, I think is bringing us back there in terms of thinking. I'm really fascinated by a kind of something I would call architecture inside out. Like really kind of thinking about interiority in a sense of how an interior can begin to drive an architectural space, but not interior in the conventional sense that we might think of it as being inside the confines of a room, but maybe some of the things that you're suggesting where the interior can be both a threshold condition or a cavity, or it can be something that is a sort of void or a vacuum kind of pocket of space within a solid. But I think that that's really that's a very important territory for right now in terms of architectural investigation, would be this: how can we really begin to reconsider the interior as something fundamental? I mean, really, you know, architecture is not only about making objects that are apprehensible from the exterior, but I think a lot of the discussion right now of what is an object or a withdrawn object, or a lot of the speculative realist discourse, maybe makes us also rethink that a bit, that how can we define, like, where does the exterior end and the interior begin? When are we actually inside? How deep inside are we when we are in an interior space? Is it radically different from what we perceive as the exterior of that space?
While looking through the work you've done with networks and how you deal with wiring, it felt like a wiring system has been extracted from a building, and now the ghost of what the building used to be lingered through the way people interacted with the piece. When it comes to your work, should we just talk about what we see or what it does? In a peculiar way, I want to ask you, how should we talk about your work?
Well, again, I think this returns to one of the issues we started out with, where a lot of the time I used to talk about what I called hardware and software, which is something also in my academic research for my dissertation that comes up, which is really about the more visible attributes of something versus things that are less visible but are equally present. So when we were working a lot with the kind of electronic work where light or sound was one of the media in play, there you could really directly kind of separate these things and say, okay, the wires, there's a sort of hardware of seeing what those wires inscribe in a space, and then there's kind of a softer relationship of things that filter through it. In the current work, I would say, well, I'm thinking about the Aquiotrope exhibition again. The wiring there is a very different kind of thing than in Sporg. In Sporg, we almost really designed the wiring circuit to be very precise and almost outline the presence of the modules and track them very cleanly. In Aquiotrope, that was a workshop. The wiring was, what we decided was, let's look at how a group of people, namely a group of SciArc students who were engaged in the workshop that accompanied our exhibition, how they could engage in a collective improvisational process to begin to organize, in a sense, this matter, which was, so we have all these cables, we have 9 points of connection where the whole thing is a live circuit, so electricity is flowing through the whole thing, it's all functioning. But at the same time, rather than just minimizing and neatly sort of dressing the wire, we decided, let's allow the wire to become excessive, to start to form another kind of layer in the space, to form a kind of canopy. So we call this thing the cable sargassum, because sargassum seaweed is the seaweed that floats on the surface of the water and kind of dangles down. So the cables were actually intended to produce this layer that was slightly, it had a degree of excess and disorder and a certain entropic quality, but yet nonetheless it was very functional in a sense. So I think that, there's a kind of, again, and the wiring also acted as a reflection on the drawing. There was a resonance between the black outline of the geometric primitives that were drawn on the wall, and then the black cables creating almost this three-dimensional drawing in the space. So the intention was that the idea of drawing begins to migrate through the pieces in the exhibition, from the wall to that trellis, to the layout for the literal plan for the pieces on the ground.
Talking about these reflections or projections, with your work when it's designed, you challenge the figure, you challenge the geometry. How much of the object is actually designed as the object, and how much of the object is designed to create a certain effect or a certain shadow or a certain projection?
That is another excellent question, because in a sense, it is almost like each thing will propagate another thing from itself. So that reflexivity, I realize, it's funny, in this conversation, I'm realizing more and more, it is something that is present in a lot of our work, is the idea that, specifically in the Semblance show, the way that the pieces were lit on the podium, like in the gallery, so you get a 3D print, but the light is directed in a specific way to cast a shadow and then to make a connection to, is it casting a shadow back onto that drawing, or is that drawing an image of that shadow? So there is almost this kind of maybe layer of associations that starts to get produced. And yeah,
No, I'm fascinated forever.
And the projection, it's true that the projection, when one thinks about how we use, as architects, how one thinks about projective geometry, things that literally get sort of thrown through space onto another surface, and the way that a drawing, in a sense, is almost catching the projection of another object, that produces a dialogue.
If I was to rephrase the question, just because I think it's really interesting, and just to elaborate on it a little bit more, are you designing the tool that will do something else, or are you designing the product?
I would say the product, I don't know if I would call them tools. Maybe I would call them, I'm not sure what the correct word would be for it, but they generate I like this word, propagating. I think Robin Evans uses this in his introduction to the projective cast. He talks about the idea of an elastic drawing that will propagate images of itself in space. It's like a quote that I love that I'm not remembering exactly, but the idea that something propagates images of itself, so that we constantly are apprehending things in various ways. So maybe one could say these are propagators.
I like that. As you just mentioned a quote that you like, you analyze and quote many artists and writers to either explain the work or show how they've influenced it. Do you ever become self-referential in the sense that you only indulge in your own past work?
No. That one's an easy, short answer. No, there's always, I think, constantly, I'm always looking at other, I say artists in the sense of writers or thinkers, or that there is usually our projects actually always have names which are very specific, and they're almost names that you could imagine a series of creatures or whatever, like the aquiotrope, sporg, lattice archipelagic. Like they're certain, they almost become personified. And again, that's intentional, that there's this kind of cast of characters, in a sense, that's developed. And each one sort of has a set of both. There are often architectural precedents, like the Arles town hall that I mentioned. But then there are non-architectural precedents. There's a book called The Grey Book by Aris Fioretis that really was the impetus for a lot of the thinking that went into the Aquiotrope project and the way that we worked with the concrete and the pigmentation of the concrete and how we could use different degrees of pigmentation to kind of begin to make the geometry less legible. So when something became very dark, the creases in the form would be, you could no longer read them as clearly as when it was a lighter gray. And so, again, those ideas of graying come from this book that Fioretis wrote, where he was looking at the ambiguous zone between literary criticism and fiction, and how his own writing was kind of moving between these two genres, and the gray area that he was exploring. We thought, well, what if we're exploring that gray area in terms of how contemporary architects, what our attitude is toward geometry, if it's no longer about this really pure virtuosic working with geometry, but so we're in a gray zone, and how can we kind of literalize that through a series of things we produce for this show? So there again, it's always reflecting on something, I think, outside of our own work.
Let's end with a play on words.
Okay.
What is the difference to you between architecture and architectural and architecturality?
Architecturality actually makes me think of Julia Kristeva, the intertextuality, something that Jeff Kipnis and Peter Eisenman have also recently discussed is how one can begin to create a very specific disciplinary conversation by speaking about differences into works of architecture. And in order to do that, there has to be a really kind of clear ground for that comparison to take place, that one could say, well, we compare two buildings, but that would still be too broad and too vague. So two buildings that are dealing with a specific quality or a specific, maybe they're looking at the translation of something that both are doing in a different way, or two buildings that are related to the same precedent, that there become moments where these things start to approach one another with a proximity that makes the comparison all the more productive. And I think that's what I would call interarchitecturality, would be the moment where one also kind of gauges one's own work vis-a-vis in relation to the works of other architects, but in a very specific way. So I mean, I like the fact that these things may not, in some sense, resemble one another in a conventional sense, but there is a kind of underlying thematic or an underlying logic that allows us to really compare them in a very precise way. And I mean, that's a really beautiful thing, I think, when that can happen. And architecture, I think, is all of this. I mean, many of the things we've been speaking about. I mean, it's the way we view the world, the way we view each other, the way that allows us to translate those ideas, those concepts into physical things, into documents that might be given to someone else to produce that physical thing. I mean, that constantly, I think that's really important, is that architecture is such a, I find it, it's a very conceptual process that engages the intellect. And I think that learning how we have certain thoughts and concepts and then how we kind of use them to to place things in a world and then to allow others to engage with that. I mean, that's really, to me, the profound sort of act of architecture. The third, the architectural, is maybe has to do with those things that we consider that the moment a certain piece of text or the moment a certain painting becomes the impetus for a project, that thing, I believe, can be called architectural. So I could say that the Grey Book by Aris Fioretis is an architectural work within my practice because I have in some way folded that in to the production of something that is architectural. So even though the intention of the author is not that to be architectural, I think once these things become almost reappropriated by us as architects, one could call them architectural.
Perfect. On a personal note, I'd like to end by saying not every school gets to have a Marcelyn Gow. Not every school gets someone as generous as you. We're extremely lucky here at SIARC, so thank you very much for sitting down with me today.
Thank you very much, Zaid. I appreciate very much the opportunity. Thank you.